All right, welcome to Unit 3. So we're going to start off this unit by talking about the median voter. So what is this median voter theorem? It's really a way to think about politics and policies. This is pretty different from some of the other stuff we're talking about. So lots of the other things in our class so far have really focused on sort of, nuts and bolts of politics or political science. We've kind of gone down some paths, but they're looking at very, real world things that you observe. Not to say this is something you can observe, but this is something that we think about theoretically. So it's just a way to think about politics and policy. It's a way a lot of, I think, political scientists think about both politics and policy and elections. So this theorem, it's logically consistent, but only under a strict set of assumptions. Lots of those assumptions actually don't hold up in the real world. And we're going to more or less ignore some of the technical aspects of this theorem. If you were to Google median voter theorem, you'll find stuff that ranges from, here's some simple news articles about it to like some very technical math heavy papers. So we're going to ignore most of the technical aspects of this. If you want to take a class on game theory, which is sort of the median voter theorem tends to fall under game theory, or rational choice theory, there might be an econ class, and I think there's a political science class that's offered every once in a while that goes into this in much more detail. Anyway, so we're going to ignore some of the stuff, but I think it's still useful in a way, even thinking about this at like a very high level. And so we'll look at the median voter theorem in two applications. So one is voters picking things. This could be voters picking policy or picking candidates. And then the other is candidates or parties positioning themselves to run elections. So these are in some ways two sides of the same coin, but we'll look at sort of both of these applications, and having different applications might help you to understand the theorem a little bit better. Okay, so things to remember, voters pick whatever is closest to their preference. So basically, voters are given choices, and they're going to pick the thing that they like the most. And we sort of have to define what they like the most, and it's going to be whatever is closest to them on some sort of ideological spectrum. And we're going to keep things very simple. We're only going to think about things in what political scientists or economists would say is one dimension. Politics is very complicated, not necessarily one-dimensional, but we're only going to think about things in one dimension here. As soon as you put sort of two dimensions or more than two dimensions, it gets really, really complicated. And when I mean dimensions, I might say we're just going to think about things in terms of being liberal or conservative. But sometimes we talk about political dimensions with one being an economic dimension and maybe one being, a social policy or something. So how much should the government be involved in the economy, and how much should the government be involved in social things? And so those would be two dimensions, but we're going to collapse everything down to one dimension, being just liberal or conservative. So again, voters pick whatever's closest to their preference, be it a policy proposal. And so just as an example, in the 2020 election, if you're voting in Oklahoma, you're going to get to vote on some policy, right? There'll be some state questions. One of them has to do with criminal justice reform. So how are people going to be sentenced? And so as a voter, you get to have a direct vote on this policy. And then lots of votes on candidates, right? Just which candidate do you like better than another? So again, this generally only works with two options. As soon as you have three proposals, I'll show sort of toward the end what can happen. But with three proposals, things can start to get more complicated. So we're going to focus mostly on two. One time we'll look at when you have three options. And you generally need a majority of the votes to win, be this on policy or the candidate. Actually, it's more true for policy. Sometimes in the candidate, like you don't need a majority, and we're not going to go down sort of the electoral college path here. That sort of starts to complicate things. But the way we think about this proposal, especially with two options, is you need a majority of the votes to win. Of course, we know sometimes you only need the most votes, so not necessarily a majority, but the most. But here we're going to focus on needing a majority of votes. Okay. So here we're going to walk down an example. In this case, we're talking about voters picking policy. And so we can think about voters in a legislature And again, sometimes voters pick policy in elections if they're voting on, maybe like a state question. But we're going to simplify things here. Okay, so here's our line. This is the dimension, the policy space, the ideological spectrum, and we just put liberal on the left and conservative on the right. These dots are going to be voters. So we're going to have 5 voters, and some voters like 1 and 2 we might describe as liberal, 5 might be a conservative voter, and 3 and 4 are kind of in the middle. So squares are things to vote on. So we have red square and green square, and you can just think of those as 2 different policies. And so voters will pick the closest square. So red, the red square, voters 1 and 2 are gonna, if they are picking between red and green, are gonna pick red, right? So both for voters 1 and 2, the red square is closest to them. And so they just pick the policy that's closest to them on this liberal conservative spectrum. So the red proposal is more liberal. And so voters 1 and 2 like it. The green square, voters 4 and 5 are clearly going to pick the green square because that's closest to them, right? Then we can think, what does voter 3 do? Red is closer. So voter 3 picks red. So what happens is the red proposal wins 3-2 because it gets more votes. Someone might be thinking, like, what if 3 is exactly in between red and green? In economics or game theory, we would say you flip a coin. So it's a coin flip that they decided they get to vote for. But anyways, so, okay. So just to recap, because this sort of sets the stage for all the things that are going on here, is you have voters and you have policy, and the voters just vote for the thing that's closest to them. It's actually pretty straightforward at this level. So in this case, voters 1 and 2 pick red, and 1, 2, and 3 pick red, and 4 and 5 pick green, so red wins 3-2. Okay, so 3 is the median or the middle voter, and voter 3 is decisive, right? So that is, her vote is the one that makes the difference. So 1 and 2 we know are going to vote for red, 4 and 5 we know are going to vote for green, 3 is sort of the one in the middle, the median voter theorem is the one that we care about, right? Because their vote makes the difference. And if you have an odd number of voters, someone is always the median. This can kind of work with an even number of voters, but involves some coin flips. So it gets a little more complicated. So we're just gonna, for the purpose of this lecture, assume that we always have an odd number of voters. I should say as an aside, the Supreme Court right now has 8 voters, and this theorem applies to the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, if there's a tie, the winner is actually the status quo. And so that means whatever the last court below the Supreme Court ruled, if there's someone that ruled below them, then the status quo is the winner. So whatever the sort of the existing policy or existing ruling. That's pretty common with an even number, that if there's a tie, the status quo or existing policy is the winner. So you need to win the median. So like, that's sort of like, I'm going to repeat this ad nauseum. The person in the middle, the median, they're the key. And so that's the part you want to appeal to. Median picks the winner, like I said, ad nauseum. Okay, so that was a simple explanation. And so now we're going to walk down, like, how would this work in a legislature? And we'll complicate the model by adding another chamber on each step. So this is a 1-chamber legislature without an executive branch. They don't usually exist. Actually, you could think of this as maybe like Parliament or something with in the UK. Where there's a prime minister, but the prime minister is part of the legislature. Anyways, it might just confuse things, but here, 1-chamber legislature, no executive branch. Our same line policy space, liberal, conservative. Our same dots, except this case, let's call them representatives instead of voters, but you can call them whatever you want. So we have the same ones here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Squares are things to vote on. So red is a policy proposal. In this case, we'll call it a bill. And then green is the status quo, right? So when a legislature usually votes on things, they have this new thing called a bill that proposes some policy. And then usually what also exists is the old policy. And we call the old policy or the current policy the status quo. So you might imagine a world where there's a bill that's going to change healthcare. And so whatever the new bill is, let's call it Medicare for all or something, say the Democrats are in charge and they propose Medicare for all. The current policy or status quo might be the Affordable Care Act. And so when representatives are voting, they're thinking, okay, my options are this new thing, this new healthcare bill or whatever. And if that doesn't win, we still have the old policy, the status quo, which I guess would be the Affordable Care Act. It's probably more complicated than that, but think about it that way. Sometimes there's a totally new policy proposal and like the status quo is nothing, like it doesn't exist. Or sometimes the status quo might be, you know, the government does nothing. So as an example, every year the Congress needs to vote on appropriations, so spending money. And if they don't do that by a certain deadline, Congress spends no money. So sometimes the proposals and the status quos are very far apart, right? The proposal on appropriations might be, you know, the government spends $1 trillion and the status quo is the government spends no dollars. And that's pretty far apart, right? So if you don't pass these bills by a deadline, the government's not allowed to spend money anymore. Okay, anyways, red, new policy proposal, bill, green, current policy, called the status quo. And the voters just pick either the bill or the status quo. Same thing as before, right? Sounds like we complicated this, but it works out exactly the same way. So red, representatives 1, 2, and 3, they like the red bill because it's closest to them. Green is the status quo. Representatives 4 and 5 like the status quo better. So essentially they vote no. And the 1, 2, and 3 vote yes, right? So you're voting yes or no. Yes is for the bill, no is for the status quo. So 1, 2, and 3 vote yes, 4 and 5 vote no. What does this mean? The bill passes, right? So we have a new policy, right? So remember, this is just one chamber. There's no executive branch. So all you have to do is pass this stage and, you know, the bill passes, it becomes law. Okay. So in this, we're just gonna walk through another example here. And here we're flipping the bill and status quo locations. So in our first example, the red bill is sort of to the left of 3 and status quo is to the right. And here we're just gonna flip them just to think about how, like, what would happen in this case. So here, 4 and 5 vote for the bill. So 4 and 5 vote yes. 1, 2, and 3 vote no, which means they're voting for the status quo. And so the status quo, no policy change. So just, you can see, like, here's how a bill would pass and here's how a bill would fail. In reality, usually if party leaders, well, I contradict myself later, so I won't say anything here. Okay, so what's the key lesson? Key lesson 2 is, again, the median voter is the key. This is always the key lesson. But the position of the bill and the status quo are important. So the status quo, you know, is in a certain position, the bill might not pass. But if the bill is in a better position, the bill will pass. Status quos are generally fixed by current law, and I kind of got ahead of myself talking about status quos here, but they're generally fixed. Like I said, sometimes, like, they might not exist if you have like this brand new policy, like how do we regulate the internet? Well, in that case, you could say the status quo might be like no regulation. But anyways, it's usually fixed. Sorry, my mouse is not clicking here. Click through. Okay. It's generally hard to change status quos near the median. And so usually when, like, one political party is in power for a long time, the status quos end up near the middle of the ideological spectrum, so it might be hard to change. So if the status quo is near the median, that means people are kind of happy with policy, and it's hard to change something and move it off the median. But you can, of course, propose different bills. that might make policy, the new bill might be a little closer to the median than the status quo. Okay, so now we have a one-chamber legislature, and we're going to add a little wrinkle. We're going to add an executive branch. So essentially, we add a president in this case. So everything is the same, right? Lines policy space, the dots are representatives, but now we have the big dot, and this is the president with the veto. So we sort of vote in order here. First, the legislature votes, and then the president, who has a veto, is allowed to vote. So same thing, red is the new policy proposal, green is the status quo. And so 1, 2, and 3 vote yes, 4 and 5 vote no. So the bill passes, but now the president, what's the president going to do, right? So if you want to sort of solve this, you think about which of these things, the bill or the status quo, is closer to the president, the big dot there, right? And obviously the status quo is closer to the president. So president prefers the status quo, so the president is going to veto. You can think about, is there an override? So you need 2/3, which is 66%, to get an override. So you actually would need 4 of 5 representatives to vote for the bill to get an override, which you don't have here. So have the status quo. Okay, so now we're going to have a 2-chamber legislature with an executive branch. So 3 is the lower chamber or the House median. So sort of, this is how we've been working all along. And we kind of figured out, like, we can ignore 1, 2, 4, and 5. So we assume their preferences are fixed and they're going to vote how they're going to vote. So I'm just going to pull them off the figure here because we know 4 and 5 are going to vote for the status quo. 1 and 2 are going to vote for the bill. So we're concerned about 3 in the middle here. So I'm just going to pull them off the figure just so it gets a little less confusing. If you want, you can draw them back in or something. Okay, same thing. Red is our new policy proposal. Green is the status quo. The House votes for the bill, so the bill passes, right? That's the same thing in the last 2 examples. Now we introduce S. This is the Senate median. So again, like, this is the position we're concerned about. And so the Senate median picks between the red policy proposal, the bill, or the status quo. S also votes for the bill, so the bill passes. Now we throw in the president, the big dot, right? What's the president going to do? If the president is in this position, the president prefers the green status quo to the red bill, so the president vetoes. So if the president is over on this conservative side, the president vetoes. If the president's over here on the liberal side, they're actually going to sign the bill. So the position of sort of these key players, the president, the Senate median, the House median, they're the ones that matter here, right? So because it's the median voter that matters. We made this a little complicated because we have sort of 3 votes. We have a House vote and a Senate vote and a president vote. Okay, so what are our lessons from this? You need approval from 3 people, the House median, the Senate median, and the president. The position of the status quo in bills are important. In theory, you can propose any bill, right? This is in theory, but in practice, how does this really work in practice? Is the chamber leaders control what gets a vote. So the power of Nancy Pelosi as the speaker, or the power of Mitch McConnell as majority leader in the Senate, is they essentially decide what's going to get a vote and what doesn't get a vote. Now there's all these paths where, like, you can have a discharge petition, or Chuck Schumer can offer a motion to proceed, and if enough senators are in favor, then you can vote on those things. But for the most part, the chamber leaders decide what gets a vote. That's the real power of the chamber leaders, is deciding on what gets vote. Chamber leaders don't do a lot of telling members, you must vote this way or you must vote that way. What they do is they figure out where do I have a majority of support from my party. So when Nancy Pelosi decides what bills is the House going to vote on, she's like, do I have enough votes in the Democratic caucus to pass this bill? If she does, it gets a vote. Mitch McConnell does the same thing for the most part in the Senate. Do I have enough votes from the Republican caucus in the Senate to pass this bill? Now, sometimes we have a filibuster, so you might need 60 votes, so you need to pick up some Democrats. And then along the way, they think about, like, well, this person might vote for it, but it might hurt them in the next election, so we're not going to vote on it. So what do? Chambers, they vote on bills they know won't pass, meaning sort of become law, make it through the next chamber, to make the other side look bad, are ones that make their side look good. So the Democrats in the House are going to vote on a bunch of stuff that's going to pass the House. They know it's going to fail in the Senate, or the president might veto, because it makes them look good and the other side look bad. Like messaging bills, it's kind of a waste of time. Might help you sort of win elections, but it's not good at solving policy. And then at the same time, the chambers are reluctant to pass bills that give the other side credit. So right now, well, when I'm talking now, when you listen to this, it might be different. But so Nancy Pelosi is negotiating with Steve Mnuchin, but the executive branch and to some extent the Senate about another stimulus package to help people who are harmed by the coronavirus. There's some smaller bill that'll pass. It's, I don't know, like $1.5 trillion. That's certainly going to help people, right? Like it would be good to pass that. But Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, they want, I don't know, a $2 trillion package, or one that includes this but doesn't include that. And so one reason why they won't compromise is it'll make the Senate Republicans and President Trump look good. So what are they, what's a possibility is they might sort of hold off passing anything maybe until Biden wins the election so Biden can get credit, right? And the Democrats would likely control the Senate. So they'll all get credit for passing the stimulus legislation. So, politics is always involved here. Okay, so we're gonna change things up. So the first set there was looking at sort of voters picking policy. And now we're gonna think about candidates trying to win elections. So yeah, so far we pitted bills versus status quo. Now we have two parties or candidates competing for voters. So the thing that makes it a little different is parties can change their positions because for the most part, when parties or candidates are running for office, they're just talking, right? They're saying, here's what I'm gonna do, here's what I won't do. So it's not an actual bill, and they can think about, oh, like what are the things the voters want? Oh, they want this kind of policy. They'll just say like, well, this is what I'll do. And it makes you look like you're positioned a certain way. It's possible to change your rhetoric a little bit to move along the ideological spectrum to get you closer to where most of the voters are. And then parties can certainly change positions over time, right? So I don't know, 8 years ago, 6 years ago, the Republicans were the party of free trade and these free trade agreements, although Clinton helped pass one of them. But anyways, like sort of it was a Republican stance to be in favor of free trade. And now somehow that's flipped under Trump, where like the Republicans are now against free trade and offshoring and those sorts of things. And the Democrats, I don't know if Democrats are in favor of it, but like, I don't know. The parties tend to flip on these things because whatever helps them win office. And we could actually talk about the same thing about supporting civil rights. So, after the Civil War, the Republican Party was the party supporting civil rights and the Democrats were against. But over time, maybe starting in the 50s or the 60s, the parties started to, and beyond, the party started to flip somewhat on that, although complicating things are the Southern Democrats tended to be against civil rights. It was the white Southern Democrats were against civil rights for a long time, and some Republicans were for civil rights, but I don't know. I feel like that is flipped, especially if you look at generally the parties today versus the parties after the Civil War. So you see a lot of like, oh, the Democrats used to be against civil rights, and like, well, that's true, but the parties have generally flipped on that. Status quos tend to be fixed. So the candidates can't change the status quos until they win office and pass new bills, and then the status quo moves. Leaders control bills, I already talked about that. Median is still the key. Okay, so here's an example, and I think one of the readings talks about hoteling and either talks about hot dogs here or like ice cream carts or something. But anyways, so here's an example. So we have here two hot dog carts, green hot dog cart and black hot dog cart. They both sell identical hot dogs for identical prices. And then there's the beach, I guess. I don't know why I have this example, but I've taught it for years. We have hungry people on the beach and they want to eat hot dogs. Since the price is the same, the hot dogs are the same, where are people going to go? They're just going to go buy hot dogs from the closest cart. And so this is the median of the beach here. And so all the people on the left of the median are going to go to the green hot dog cart, and all the people on the right are going to go to the black hot dog cart. And each hot dog cart gets half of the beach. So I should say too, the hot dog vendors, they want to maximize the number of hot dogs they sell. That's kind of important. So they want to sell more hot dogs. So here they split. They think, okay, I want to sell more hot dogs. What can I do? So you should think if one of these carts wants to sell more hot dogs, what should they do? They should move to more of the people, right? So there's only 2 carts. So what happens, green moves to the right. They're like, well, all the people, sort of on the far edge of the beach here, like they're still going to come to me. But we have a new midpoint between green and black. So green gets more customers by moving right? So we have a new midpoint between the 2 carts. And so all the people to the left of the midpoint go to green, to the right go to black. So green gets more customers by moving towards right or towards the middle. What's black gonna do? Black's gonna make the same thing. They're gonna match the move. And then the midpoint actually, because they're equidistant, more or less, we go back to the old midpoint and each get half. And then what do? They eventually go to the middle. So both move to the center or the median. And so they end up right next to each other. You're like, well, that's kind of weird. They have the same outcome as the beginning, but there's no incentive to move off of this, right? If green were to move to the left, sort of back where they were, black could keep coming, right? And so they would win. They would sell more hot dogs. So they end up in the middle here. Close enough. My dots are off by a little bit, but close enough. So each ends up at the median and share half of the beach. Okay, and you're like, does that work in the real world? Do hot dog carts move next to each other? Actually, sometimes they do. But think about like gas stations are across from each other. All sorts of businesses that are similar end up being right near each other because it's the best place to be. So if you go to more, like there's a Lowe's and Home Depot who are like basically across the street from each other. And there's lots of cities where the Lowe's and the Home Depot are across from each other. Or here in Norman, there's a Crest across from the SuperTarget, right? So 2 supermarkets basically are right across the street from each other. I was like, well, that's probably the best place to be. And then we diverge a little bit here because like SuperTarget and Crest end up like, okay, they're the same distance. So then they actually end up fighting on like prices, and Crest is generally cheaper, but maybe SuperTarget sells some things you can't find at Crest. I don't know. But anyways, they move near each other. So what about political parties, right? This is sort of this weird hot dog cart in stores, although it works for them. So how does this work for parties? So this guy, Anthony Downs, sort of takes this actually hot dog cart theorem, or this theorem that was for business, and applies it to political parties in a book called The Economic Theory of Democracy. It's actually pretty easy to read and kind of short. So if you're really into it, Economic Theory of Democracy by Anthony Downs, like give it a read. Very insightful book. And it's very readable. Okay, so what do? We assume 2 parties, and generally assume a liberal party and a conservative party. Currently, that matches up, I guess, pretty well with Democrats and Republicans. Good enough for this lecture. So what do voters do? They pick the team or the party that's closest to them. The further away the team is, the more the voter doesn't like that team. And direction actually doesn't matter. So you just vote for whoever's closest to you, and like we call this single peaked preference. So that's starting to get into these technical things, but basically we sort of have this triangle where you vote for whoever's closest to you. Kind of look behind me. That's sort of an idea of a single peak preference a little bit. So we also assume things like everyone votes and there's only 2 candidates. And both of those assumptions are flawed, but that's how we have to work the theorem. Again, it's still useful because if you think about like, well, why doesn't this work? It's because some of these assumptions don't work. But it kind of gets us a far way into thinking about politics. So still useful, even though it's not perfect. No theory is 100% perfect anyways. Okay. So we have our ideological spectrum, we have a voter, there's the median, we have some candidates, blue candidate and red candidate. That's voter one, the star, we call it their ideal point. This is sort of just like the language that we use for this. But so voter one's ideal point is there at the star, and she wants the candidate, ideally, to be at the star, but will vote for the closest party anyways. So voter one votes for blue. Now you might think about like, is it possible for both of the parties to be so far away that the voter just isn't going to vote? According to the theorem, no, right? In the theorem, we assume everyone votes, no matter how far apart the candidates are from the voters. But in the real world, we know sometimes there's people who are like, I don't like either of these candidates. They're too far away. I'm not going to vote at all. So that happens in the real world, but in this lesson, we're going to assume that everyone votes because it complicates things when people don't vote. Okay, so here we have one voter. Now let's assume, instead of one voter, there's lots of voters. But again, it's the median, it's the middle that's important. The same thing from all the lessons here. It's the median voter, the one in the middle, that's important because they're the one who's decisive. So what happens? So what do the candidates do? Just like the hot dog carts, they're going to move to the middle because they want to get that vote in the middle because they know everyone to the other side is going to vote for them, right? So you move to the middle, and essentially you get a tie because the median voter is decisive, and like I said before, we assume they like flip a coin for the winner. So we can think of like, does this happen with real world candidates? Do they converge to the median? So one, like to move from all the way to the ends to the middle at one time for a candidate is like probably like not reasonable or not believable. Although, I don't know, candidates can say whatever they want. Some things candidates do is they try sometimes not to announce their positions, especially on key things. So as an example, like Biden refuses to answer the question about increasing the number of justices in the Supreme Court. He's just like, basically, I'm not going to answer that question. So we don't know where he is on this spectrum. But what do the voters do? If you're a median voter, you're like, maybe he's not going to do it because I consider increasing the number of justices in the court in the liberal direction is like a very liberal thing to do. So if you're at the middle, you're like, well, he's kind of a moderate. He likes to get along, I guess. We're going to assume he's not going to increase the members in the court. But if you're a liberal, you might be like, maybe he'll do it. I'll vote for him. But Biden is trying to take all these moderate stances on things. Conservatives might not believe they're moderate, but compared to the alternative candidates like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, he has like the moderate Democratic positions. So, is it reasonable to assume the candidates can move all the way from the ends to the middle? Like, probably not, but they can move a little bit. But generally, like, are two presidential candidates near the middle? Like, for the most part, they are. It might not look that way, but the most part, like, they kind of are, right? So, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they ran on, I think I have this right, like, Medicare for all. So basically, or a single payer system, which I know I'm confusing the terms a little bit, but like a much more like radical change to our healthcare than Joe Biden. And the voters didn't pick them, right? They picked Biden. There's all sorts of policies like the Green New Deal is probably, much more further to the left than the median voter in the United States. Biden like says he has his own thing. Like, is it close to the Green New Deal? Yeah, probably. But it looks like it's in the middle. And so the voters like the candidate in the middle. Whereas Trump, like, I don't know, it's hard to tell on some things. On some things, he's conservative, like, appointing justices to the court. He's going to pick a conservative justice. I don't know, on other things, like, I just don't know. Depends on the day of the week, I guess. Anyways, this kind of works, right? Our candidates tend to be towards the middle. What happens if you have a third party? So this starts to complicate things. So sort of, I guess. So you think of this voter here in between blue and green, and then everyone to the left of that new line there votes for green. Everyone to the right votes for blue. And what happens? Red wins. So blue and green split these votes, and then the other person wins. So you can imagine a world even where like 60% of the voters like green and blue, but they split 30-30, and then red wins with 40. So this can happen in presidential elections. I know I said at the beginning, like we assume the majority wins. That's thinking more about policy than it is sort of this presidential election. And then I'm also, again, I'm ignoring the electoral college here. So this has happened in 2000, like Ralph Nader probably, I shouldn't say stole, but some people voted for Ralph Nader over Al Gore. And that, that was enough to cost him the election. Probably the opposite happened in 1992, where enough people voted for Ross Perot that stole votes from George, again, I shouldn't say steal, took votes away from George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton wins. This happened in 2016, like maybe, maybe just enough people voted for the Green Party or these third-party candidates in Wisconsin and Michigan to tip the balance away from Clinton towards Trump in those places. So, the two parties generally want to keep the third parties out unless the third party is going to harm the other one. So, this time around, Republicans might want third parties to run to take votes away from Biden. So it just depends on where they're positioned. Okay, what about primaries, right? So we have sort of this multi-stage election process for president here, and other seats too, where first the voters from the candidate's party choose who gets to run in the general election, and then you have the general election. So primary voters tend to be more extreme, right? So here we have on the bottom, we have our general election median, but we have the liberal or Democratic median to the left and the red or primary median on the right here. And so like, what do the candidates do is they end up getting this multi-stage election where the first stage is the more extreme voters, ends up pulling the candidates off the general election median towards their primary medians. So this gives us some daylight between the two candidates. Can they move back towards the general election median? In the general election, they can move towards it, but to hit it might be pretty hard because you've announced positions in the primary, perhaps, and so you might have to change those positions might be difficult. So candidates are careful about what they say in the primary because they might be worried about the general election stage. And then sometimes voters think about this. They're like, well, who's the more electable candidate? And so they might vote for, they voted for Biden because they thought he was electable because he's closer to the median. So this idea works pretty well for congressional elections too, right? So each district's election probably has a primary, has a general, they have candidates, they're positioned, and the winner of the general election and congressional elections tends to sort of represent the median of the district. So if you look at some data, Republicans tend to represent conservative districts, Democrats represent liberal ones. I would say they're probably generally pulled off the general election median and closer to the primary median. But generally speaking, again, Republicans represent conservative districts and Democrats represent liberal districts. If we want to measure liberal conservativeness by, say, how the district voted in the presidential election, there's only a handful of congressional seats controlled by the Republicans that Clinton won, and just a handful of congressional seats controlled by the Democrats that Trump won. So everything's sort of, especially now because we've a very polarized electorate, everything seems to be split. It goes how we'd expect given how the voters vote and sort of what the parties control, which I realize is kind of circular there, but like we don't have a lot of ticket splitting is probably what I'm trying to get at today because there's a big difference between the two parties. I talked about that. Sort of Congress is the combination of lots of members in multiple chambers, so it starts to get a little complicated. If this was a different class, we spent time talking about sort of Arrows and possibility theorem and trying to combine like the preferences of all these little medians gets to be difficult. And actually the Arrows and possibility theorem says it's like sort of impossible to figure out a perfect way to do this. There's good ways, some are better than others, but there's no like perfect way to do this. Someone's going to see this and say I butchered Arrows and possibility theorem, which I kind of did, but you get the gist of it. This median voter theorem works okay in presidential elections, but the candidates get pulled off the median probably a lot more. And the like very long primary process also makes it a little harder because you don't have one primary. We have lots of primaries in the states. But this theorem works pretty well for thinking about how politics work. Like, why did that bill not pass? Because the Senate, median was against it, right? So, why doesn't the Republican Senate vote for Democratic House bills? Because the median in the Senate is a Republican. So they're going to vote no. Talk about that. Really works with 2 candidates. You can kind of explain things with 3, but what we didn't talk about is like, how the candidates might move around. If the third party pops up, maybe like one candidate actually wants to move in a different direction. And so when I say it doesn't work with 3 candidates, it's because the candidates start moving and there's no equilibrium. The equilibrium or the outcome with 2 candidates is with one election and everyone votes as they move to the middle. Trying to get an equilibrium with 3 candidates is harder. So again, still a pretty useful way to think about politics. So that's the median voter theorem. Again, I think it's pretty useful. When I think about politics, sort of I imagine these things in my head, and you probably think I'm weird because I do that. But I don't know, that's how I do it. So there we go. Thanks.